when Princess Anne rose from her seat and openly defied every unwritten rule of royal conduct. The palace walls trembled, not from noise, but from silence. What she said next, in defense of Diana and against Camilla, was something the monarchy was never prepared to hear. The room had been filled with the polished, rehearsed elegance of yet another royal gathering. The air was heavy with expectation, where every move and every word was meant to follow the centuries-old script of control. But this time, something entirely different was about to unfold. All eyes, as they so often were, rested on Anne, expecting her to sit with her usual composure, stoic, restrained, the princess who rarely played into drama. Instead, she was about to become the storm. The whispers had already started long before the ceremony began. Camilla's presence, increasingly dominant, had unsettled more than a few within the palace walls. Some saw her as the stabilizing figure Charles needed, but others, Anne most of all, saw something else. A woman who had fought her way into power at a cost no one dared name aloud. Those whispers spread like wildfire, tightening the atmosphere around the family like a suffocating cloak. As speeches echoed through the hall, polished words intended to celebrate tradition, Anne's expression shifted ever so slightly. It was not anger, but something deeper. A fire stoked by memories too long buried. The ghost of Diana hovered invisibly. Among them, her name unspoken yet undeniable, her absence louder than any presence could ever be. Anne's sudden movement was startling. She broke the unspoken rule of stillness, her body rising before any signal allowed her to speak. Gasps were muffled. Courtiers stiffened in shock, unsure if they were witnessing a mistake or a deliberate rebellion. For in the monarchy, protocol was not mere formality, it was survival. Yet here was Anne, prepared to throw centuries of carefully constructed order into chaos. She did not wait for permission, nor did she offer the polite preambles expected in such a company. Her voice cut through the hall like a blade, direct, sharp, and impossible to ignore. There was no hesitation, no falter. This was not a slip of the tongue, it was an attack on silence itself. The effect was immediate and unforgettable. Charles froze, his face rigid, torn between fury and disbelief. Camilla's composure, usually so carefully maintained, cracked. Her face drained of color, her eyes wide in disbelief that Anne would dare place her in the shadow she had fought to escape. William and Harry, seated nearby, exchanged quick, stunned looks. For them, this was more than family drama. It was their mother's name being dragged out of the silence and spoken in defiance, something they had long wished for, but never believed would come from within the palace walls. The audience remained silent, but the silence was not empty. It was charged, vibrating with the weight of unspoken truths suddenly ripped into the open. Anne's words were not rehearsed pleasantries. They were a blow against everything unacknowledged. She spoke with the conviction of someone who had waited too long, someone who had carried a burden of truth in her chest and refused to let it remain buried. Every syllable rang with loyalty, not to the crown, not to appearances, but to Diana, the woman who had been wronged, diminished, and yet never forgotten. For Anne, it was no longer about royal conduct or appearances. It was about justice. It was about defending a woman who had been stripped of dignity, yet immortalized in the hearts of millions. In that moment, Anne had declared war not just against Camilla, but against the silence that had protected her. The room did not erupt in argument, nor did it descend into chaos. Instead, the silence grew thicker, more powerful, as though the palace itself was holding its breath. But within that silence, the message was deafening. The rules of control had been broken, and the monarchy would never be able to return to the way it was before. What Anne revealed wasn't born in a single moment. It was decades in the making, tied to a rivalry, a silence, and a loyalty to Diana that no one dared to expose. Until now. Diana may have been gone for years, but her presence never left the palace. Every whisper, every glance, every scandal carried her name, and Anne knew it better than anyone. It was impossible to ignore the weight Diana left behind, a presence that lingered in every hall, in every whispered conversation that dared to brush against the truth. While Camilla tried to step into the spotlight, polishing her image with calculated grace, Diana's shadow loomed over her every move. The comparison was inevitable, cruel even, yet undeniable. Diana was remembered as the radiant princess of the people, a woman adored by millions. Camilla, in contrast, carried the burden of being seen as the intruder, the woman who entered where she was never meant to be. That comparison would never die, and Anne knew it, because she had watched the two women up close. What the world never realized was that Diana had turned to Anne in moments of deep despair, confiding in her when she trusted no one else. Behind Anne's stoic, unflinching demeanor, Diana found a listener not indulgent, not overly sentimental, but unshakably present. Anne was not known for softness, but Diana sensed a quiet strength there, a kind of respect, unspoken. The two women could not have been more different. One emotional, expressive and vulnerable. The other practical, restrained, almost cold in her composure. Yet beneath Anne's armor, there was admiration for Diana's courage, for the way she bore the unbearable and still managed to smile before the world. Diana knew Anne would not betray her words, and so she spoke, often in hushed tones, her confessions laced with fear and sorrow, laying bare the weight of her tragedies. Anne listened as Diana poured out her heartbreak, the crushing isolation of being surrounded by people yet utterly alone. She listened to the stories of betrayal, of promises broken, of a life twisted by pressures no one outside could imagine. Anne never offered comfort in flowery words. She was not that kind of woman, but she offered something stronger: silence and solidarity. She became a witness to Diana's pain, storing away every detail with a discipline that only Anne could maintain. In private, she carried the burden of these truths like sealed letters, never daring to open them, but never discarding them either. The echoes of Diana's explosive revelations still haunted Anne long after her passing. They were not simply the bitter complaints of a wronged woman. They were warnings, desperate cries from someone who felt history was conspiring against her. And as Camilla's influence grew stronger with each passing year, Anne could not ignore how eerily those warnings rang true. She watched the same patterns repeat: the manipulation of perception, the slow shifting of power, the careful rewriting of history to erase one figure and elevate another. It was as though Diana's fears had reached out from beyond the grave, wrapping their cold fingers around the present. Anne, ever silent, ever watchful, gathered these truths within herself. She spoke little, but her eyes saw everything. The monarchy prided itself on forgetting, on burying uncomfortable truths under the weight of ceremony. But Anne remembered. She remembered the words Diana spoke to her in trembling confidence. She remembered the look in her eyes when she said, "They will erase me." And she vowed, without ever saying it aloud, that she would not let that happen. She became the keeper of Diana's memory, the silent guardian of a truth no one else dared to protect. And when the moment finally came, it wasn't just about Diana's memory, it was about tearing down the veil of secrets Camilla had woven around the throne. The rivalry between Anne and Camilla wasn't new. It had simmered in the shadows of Buckingham Palace for decades. But no one dared to call it what it truly was: a battle for the soul of the monarchy. From the very beginning, Anne had been wary. She had watched Camilla enter their world not as an innocent companion, but as a figure whose intentions were far from simple. Anne's instincts rarely failed her, and in Camilla she saw ambition wrapped in charm, determination cloaked in warmth. To many, Camilla was disarming. To Anne, she was a storm quietly gathering strength. Their early encounters were tense, marked by Anne's piercing silences and Camilla's forced attempts at civility. Behind closed doors, exchanges were clipped, smiles thin, and conversations short. Courtiers noticed it, though no one dared name it openly. There was no shouting, no public feud, but the temperature dropped whenever the two women stood side by side. Camilla, trying to weave herself deeper into Charles's life, and, by extension, into the fabric of the monarchy, found in Anne a wall that would not crumble. Anne was not easily charmed, nor easily deceived, and her suspicion grew each time she witnessed Camilla step a little further into territory that had once belonged to Diana. What made the conflict even sharper was Anne's devotion to her mother's vision of the crown. Queen Elizabeth had lived by duty, by restraint, by the sacrifice of self for institution. Anne embodied that vision with iron determination, Camilla, however, seemed to Anne like the embodiment of the opposite, a pursuit of personal desire over duty, ambition disguised as affection. The clash was not only personal, but ideological. One woman standing for discipline and preservation, the other representing disruption and redefinition. To Anne, Camilla's rise threatened the very stability the monarchy had fought to maintain. Inside palace corridors, whispers carried the truth no one could say aloud. Anne never approved. It became a quiet refrain, a known reality that hung in the background of every royal event. Staff knew it, family sensed it, and Camilla herself could feel it in the way Anne's gaze lingered a moment too long, sharp and unyielding. It was a disapproval that no apology could soften, no gesture could erase. For Anne, this was not a matter of personal dislike. It was about safeguarding something sacred from someone she believed had no right to touch it. Anne's disdain revealed itself in subtle acts of defiance. She refused to adjust her tone, to offer unnecessary warmth, or to bend her traditions to accommodate Camilla's presence. A sharp remark here, a cold silence there. Small signals that carried the weight of judgment. At public engagements, Anne's body language spoke louder than words, making it clear she was not willing to pretend. Every small act, though quiet, was deliberate, calculated to remind Camilla she had not won acceptance. But the tension could not live in whispers forever. The friction grew heavier with time, the weight of it pressing down on every gathering, every ceremony, until it became undeniable. The inevitability of a clash was written in the very air they breathed. Anne, holding on to Diana's memory and her mother's vision, could not remain silent forever. And when Anne's words finally cut through protocol, it became clear this wasn't just about family. It was about the monarchy's survival. It was meant to be another royal ceremony, polished and predictable. But within minutes, the event spiraled into the most shocking public clash in modern royal history. The grand hall gleamed with tradition, its walls heavy with the echoes of centuries past, while the royal family sat in rigid formation, every gesture choreographed, every silence intentional. This was supposed to be a display of unity, a spectacle of power and poise. But beneath the surface, tensions simmered like a fire waiting for the smallest spark. The audience, both inside and beyond those walls, expected perfection. What they received was a rupture. Camilla sat in a position of prominence, her seat deliberately elevated in symbolic stature. To many, it seemed like the natural evolution of her role, a recognition of her influence and proximity to Charles. But to others, especially Anne, it felt like an insult, a rewriting of the royal script in which Diana's name and sacrifice had been quietly erased. The resentment did not need to be voiced. It was visible in stolen glances, in stiffened postures, in the way some members of the family shifted uncomfortably as the speeches began, every word praising Camilla's loyalty or her supposed service to the crown felt like a carefully constructed dig at the memory of the woman who had once borne the weight of that same role. Anne, silent and observant, caught them all. Subtle phrases disguised as acknowledgments, faint but deliberate attempts to paint Camilla as the savior of a monarchy shaken in the past. She heard the erasure, the manipulation, and the dismissal of the woman who had once stood where Camilla now sat. Each phrase landed like a dagger. For Anne, it was no longer tolerable. Diana's memory was not to be traded for political convenience, nor was her suffering to be packaged as a necessary stepping stone in Camilla's rise. Then came the breaking point. In a move that stunned every onlooker, Anne rose abruptly from her seat. The rustle of her dress echoed like thunder in the still hall, silencing the speaker mid-sentence. Her movement was not rehearsed, not permitted, and certainly not expected. A princess, bound by duty and rules thicker than stone, had decided to shatter centuries of protocol with a single act. Gasps rippled through the attendees as their heads turned toward her. Officials froze, uncertain whether to intervene or remain. Still, caught in a paralysis that matched the atmosphere of the room. Her voice followed, steady, yet charged with emotion, cutting through the hall like a blade of steel. We must never forget the woman who gave her soul to this family, Diana. Those words struck like lightning, a direct challenge not only to Camilla's rising position, but to the entire narrative the monarchy had been desperately trying to shape. It was an unmasking, an unrelenting reminder that Diana's ghost still walked those halls and that her sacrifice could not be erased, no matter how much history was rewritten to favor the present. The silence that followed was not empty. It was alive, pulsing with shock, fear, and disbelief. In that silence, the cracks in the monarchy's carefully crafted image split wide open, exposing what lay beneath: pain, betrayal, and unfinished battles. And with those words, Anne shattered the facade, dragging decades of buried pain into the open air. Camilla had fought for years to secure her place beside Charles, but in one moment, Anne's defense of Diana threatened to undo it all. For Camilla, the climb had been relentless decades of scrutiny, judgment, and whispered contempt. She had endured the ridicule of the public, the suspicion of the family, and the long shadow of Diana, finally reaching the point where her position seemed untouchable. Yet, here she was, in front of the entire royal court, hands trembling as Anne's words reverberated like a thunderclap. Her composure, so carefully crafted over time, cracked in an instant. The faint movement of her fingers betrayed her fear, her breath shallow as she tried to hold on to the mask she had worn for so long. The effect spread like a shockwave through the room. Courtiers, seasoned in handling scandal and silence, exchanged nervous glances, their whispers carrying a chilling phrase: a dangerous precedent. For if Anne, a senior royal and the Queen's daughter, could so openly break the code of silence, then what boundaries truly remained? Protocol had always been the monarchy's shield, but Anne had pierced it. Her defense of Diana was more than a tribute. It was a declaration of war against the rewriting of history. In that moment, courtiers understood that the balance of power had shifted, and no one could predict what would come next. Charles sat caught in the middle of the storm, his expression frozen, his eyes betraying the torment of being torn between his sister and his wife. He had long relied on Anne's steadiness, her loyalty to duty, her refusal to indulge in sentiment. Yet now, she was the one dismantling the carefully constructed image he and Camilla had fought to project. His silence was deafening, his hesitation damning. For Charles, every second that ticked by without response only fueled the sense that Anne's words carried truth too heavy to dismiss. His authority, his marriage, even his reign felt suddenly fragile. Meanwhile, outside the palace doors, the world was already stirring. The public had been waiting for a crack in the facade, waiting for a sign that the ghosts of the past still held sway. And now they had it. News spread swiftly, reporters sharpening their pens, cameras poised to catch the slightest expression of fallout. Anne had given them dynamite, and the explosion was already beginning to echo beyond the palace gates. This was not just family drama. It was history being rewritten live. A battle of legacies unfolding in real time. And at the center of it all was Camilla, facing the reality she had always feared most. No matter how high she climbed, no matter how carefully she positioned herself, Diana's ghost was still stronger. Diana's memory still had the power to overshadow her, to undermine her, to strip away everything she had fought for. For years, Camilla's greatest nightmare was that she would never escape being compared to the woman who came before her. And now, Anne's words had ensured that nightmare was alive again, more powerful than ever. But what truly stunned the world was not Camilla's silence. It was Anne's next revelation, one that left the monarchy gasping. What Anne revealed next wasn't just a defense, it was a confession of loyalty that rewrote the royal family's darkest history. For years, silence had been her weapon, her shield, her unspoken protest. But in that charged hall, with every eye fixed on her, she chose to speak the truth she had carried like a stone in her chest. She declared that Diana had once come to her in private, warning her of Camilla's hidden ambitions. The revelation sliced through the room like a blade. It was no longer rumor or speculation. It was testimony from a royal who had seen, heard, and remembered. Anne described conversations that the world had never known, conversations where Diana's voice trembled not with anger, but with fear. She recalled late-night talks in which Diana admitted she felt hunted, pushed aside, as though forces within her own family were plotting to erase her existence. Anne spoke of Diana's words, unforgettable and chilling, "They will erase me." For years, Anne had carried those words in silence, a haunting reminder that her sister-in-law saw the storm that would one day consume her. And now, Anne was saying it aloud, exposing it to the world, forcing the monarchy itself to confront what it had chosen to bury. The court sat in stunned disbelief, realizing this was no impulsive outburst. This was the release of decades of silence, carefully guarded truths brought to light at the moment they could no longer be ignored. The officials, trained to mask every flicker of emotion, could not hide their shock. They knew what this meant. Anne was not only defending Diana's memory, she was rewriting history. She was declaring that the story the monarchy had chosen to present was not the truth at all, but a facade designed to protect Camilla and silence Diana's legacy. It was more than a revelation. It was a symbolic strike. By speaking Diana's warnings aloud, Anne ensured that her sister-in-law would never be erased, never reduced to a footnote in Camilla's triumph. She immortalized Diana as the woman who saw the truth and dared to speak it, even if her words had been ignored while she lived. And now, through Anne's voice, those warnings had become undeniable. Diana was no longer just a memory. She was a presence in the room, stronger than ever, forcing those who had tried to silence her to face the enormity of what they had done. The monarchy had always relied on secrecy, on locking away its darkest truths behind protocol and ritual. But in that instant, those locks shattered. Anne's words forced them to look inward, to confront the choices that had led them to this point. It was a reckoning, and one that could not be undone. The room was suffused with the weight of revelation, with the haunting knowledge that Anne's confession had altered the narrative forever. Diana's ghost was no longer silent. She had been resurrected, and her truth would now demand to be heard. And once Diana's name was resurrected, the question was no longer about the past. It was about what this meant for the crown's future. The aftermath was immediate palace aides scrambling, Charles furious yet frozen, and Camilla's influence suddenly fragile. What had begun as a ceremony crafted to display continuity and control had instead collapsed into confusion. Staff moved hastily behind the scenes, whispering instructions, rushing to contain the damage, but nothing could undo the words Anne had spoken. They hung in the air like smoke after a fire, impossible to clear, impossible to ignore. And at the center of the storm stood Anne herself, unwavering, refusing every attempt to coax her into silence or retraction. Her voice had become a weapon, and she would not surrender it. Behind closed doors, the confrontation came swiftly. Charles sought her out, torn between the rage of a brother whose wife had been publicly humiliated and the resignation of a monarch who knew his authority was under siege. His words were sharp, demanding, almost desperate, but Anne met them with the same cold steel she had shown in the hall. She did not apologize. She did not retreat. Instead, she reminded him of what he seemed determined to forget, that the memory of Diana was not his to erase, nor Camilla's to overshadow. For Charles, it was a crushing realization. His power had limits, and his sister had just exposed them in front of the entire world. For William, however, the moment landed differently. Though outwardly calm, his heart surged with a quiet sense of vindication. Anne had done what he himself could not. She had spoken for his mother, unflinching, unapologetic. It was a gesture that filled him with both gratitude and sorrow. Gratitude that Diana's voice had been defended, and sorrow that it had taken so long for anyone within the EU palace to do it. He saw in Anne's defiance the loyalty he had always hoped for, a loyalty that reminded him he was not alone in carrying the weight of his mother's legacy. Across the ocean, Harry sat in disbelief as the news reached him. The reports, the whispers, the recordings of Anne's words, all of it struck him with a force he hadn't anticipated. He turned to Meghan, his voice low, his expression torn between pride and shock. For years, he had accused the institution of burying his mother's truth. Now, to hear his aunt stand before the monarchy itself and say the very words he had long believed, it was both stunning and painful. In that moment, the distance between him and his family seemed to shrink, even as the rift grew deeper. Meanwhile, senior royals felt the weight of the crisis pressing down upon them. They understood the danger better than anyone. A public clash of this magnitude wasn't simply scandalous, it was catastrophic. The institution thrived on unity, on silence, on unshakable order. Now, the divisions were glaring, undeniable, splashed across every headline and whispered in every corner of the world. They feared what would come next: a monarchy exposed, a family in pieces, and a public emboldened to question what had once seemed untouchable. The crown stood on the edge of yet another scandal, one that could rival the darkest moments of its past. The choice was clear: silence or confrontation, control or collapse. And at the heart of it all was Anne, the woman who had refused to bend, who had forced her family to confront truths they wished to bury. But Anne's storm wasn't meant to destroy, it was meant to restore something the monarchy had forgotten. For years, Diana was painted as a tragic figure, but in that moment, Anne reframed her not as a victim, but as the monarchy's lost conscience. The world, long accustomed to the carefully curated image of Diana as a fragile, heartbroken woman, suddenly saw her differently. Through Anne's defiance, she emerged as the guiding voice that had been ignored, the one who had warned, who had fought, and who had endured for the sake of truth. The narrative shifted instantly, and the impact rippled far beyond the palace walls. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Crowds gathered outside royal residences, voices rising not in anger, but in solidarity with Anne's words. Across the nation, people spoke of Diana not with pity, but with renewed reverence. They saw her as the woman who had dared to love openly, who had suffered publicly, but who had ultimately stood taller than the institution that tried to silence her. For many, Anne's speech was not just an act of loyalty, it was a national correction, a reclaiming of Diana's rightful place in the story of the crown. Social media erupted like wildfire. The hashtag #Rehearsed and defends Diana dominated global conversations, uniting millions who had long felt that Diana's truth had been buried. Videos of Anne's words spread at lightning speed, each replay stoking emotion, outrage, and admiration. Commentators declared it the moment the monarchy had been forced into accountability by one of its own. For the younger generation, Diana was no longer a figure of the past, but a symbol of authenticity in a world of performance, proof that even within the royal walls, there was someone willing to acknowledge her sacrifice. But as Diana's image rose, Camilla's fell into the harshest spotlight she had ever faced. The comparisons that once simmered in whispers now screamed across headlines. Her place beside Charles was scrutinized with a severity she had spent years trying to escape. Anne's words had made it impossible to ignore. No matter how much time had passed, Diana still held more power in absence than Camilla did in presence. And for Camilla, this was more than humiliation. It was the unraveling of everything she had worked to build. The crown itself could no longer sidestep Diana's contributions. Officials who once dismissed her as a liability were now cornered into acknowledging that her compassion, her honesty, and her defiance had shaped the modern monarchy. Anne's gamble had forced them into a position they had avoided for decades, accepting that Diana's voice still mattered, perhaps more now than ever. It was a reckoning no strategist could spin, no advisor could control. The balance of history had shifted in real time, and Anne was the one who had tipped the scale. Her act was more than rebellion. It was redemption. It gave Diana back the dignity that had been stripped from her. It restored the voice that had been silenced. And in doing so, it reminded the world that the monarchy was not invincible, that even within its ranks, there were those who would choose truth over silence. Anne's gamble had changed the course of history, and the echoes of it would shape the monarchy's future in ways no one could yet predict. And yet, Anne wasn't finished. Her closing words would seal Diana's place forever. When Anne delivered her final words, the monarchy knew nothing would ever be the same again. Her voice, steady yet unrelenting, carried the weight of decades. She declared before the world that Diana was and would forever remain the eternal princess of the people. It was not merely a statement, it was a coronation of memory, a final act of defiance that elevated Diana beyond the reach of erasure. The hall froze, the silence so heavy it seemed to swallow breath itself, until from unexpected corners came the sound of applause. It began tentatively, then grew stronger. echoing with approval from those who had longed to hear the truth spoken aloud. Camilla, unable to endure another second under the weight of those words, rose and left, her retreat as visible as her shaken composure. Charles sat motionless, his eyes cast downward, realizing with cold clarity that history had shifted in that instant, and nothing he did could reverse it. Outside, the press wasted no time, branding Anne's intervention as the vast speech that rewrote the monarchy, and for the world watching, Anne was no longer the silent princess in the shadows. She was the defender of Diana's legacy, the one who had dared to say what no one else would. And as the palace doors closed that night, one truth remained. Anne had broken protocol, but in doing so, she had given Diana the justice she was denied in life. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.